So now we're back. Alright, so I was talking about the Najdorf. Alright, so yeah, I was just talking about this guy who actually wrote a paper and did a bunch of analysis using engines and yeah, so I guess just a curiosity out of interest, if you're white, I guess either bishop e3, f3, or h3, apparently your best moves, and as black, I guess those are your biggest worries too. But there are 9 mainline continuations, and even though the computers say those 3 are the best, you still have got to be concerned about the others too, of course. All right, so let's get into them. So first of all, let's start with bishop g5. Now, by the way, I'm not going to cover exhaustive theory because it's always changing anyway, but I will try to cover some ideas. So against bishop g5, there's essentially 2 big main moves you have. One is knight bd7. And this has been kind of more topical recently. The idea by playing the knight here is that black may try to actually play g6 and fianchetto the bishop on g7, kind of going for what's called a Najdorf. That's a mix between a dragon and a Najdorf. So that's one idea, and the other big idea is e6. Now, personally, I'm probably just going to cover e6 because both Fischer and Kasparov always play this in serious games as black against bishop g5, so I think this is probably black's best here. And also, if you recently saw, there was a nice game between Lagrave and Giri where Giri got absolutely crushed in this line, so I think that says a lot about it. Now, white's most aggressive idea here is f4. The idea is white wants to play queen f3, castle queenside, with really quick aggressive attack. So white's dream position is basically, so say for example you play bishop e7, white will play queen f3, and now queen c7, castle, say knight d7, bishop d3. And then here, for example, a famous mistake for black is b4, which can be punished by knight d5. And then e takes, and the problem black has in this position is this lethal pin on the e file. So this is a famous mistake, and this is basically white's dream, is to just crush you like this, basically. Yeah, I think a lot of times too when you look at I've been looking at chessboards on USCF, and in this position for some reason is on all the boards that they're advertising for. It's kind of weird, but anyway. So it's basically white's dream, just so you know what white's going for. And because of that, a really popular idea for black is this queen b6 move, trying to throw a wrench into the works. It's called the poison pawn variation. And white has a problem because it's awkward to defend b2. You don't want to play rook b1 because then white couldn't castle queenside, and the rook would just be passive on b1. And you don't want to play knight b3 because black has his queen e3 check move, and it forces a trade of queens, which white does not want in this variation. You're going for checkmate. And by the way, just to track back a little bit, just in general, in this Najdorf variation, black's advantage is more long-term. He has fewer weaknesses, more center pawns, and white's advantage is more temporary. It's dynamic. You have an advantage in development. So, basically endgames typically favor black in the Najdorf. So usually if you can trade queens, you should definitely do so with black. And as white, you're going to want to avoid that. Just a general note. So although black's by no means winning here, he's going to be under a lot less pressure because piece sacrifices aren't really likely to work if you don't have a queen, right? So just a general note there. Yeah, so queen b6 causes white problems. So, white usually just plays queen d2 and gives up the pawn, which is why it's called the poison pawn. So this is a big line. And what's really been topical lately is this extra move black's been throwing in with h6. It turns out it's actually pretty useful. So white doesn't want to take, of course, giving up the 2 bishops, so bishop h4. And now black can play queen b6. And one difference here is that white can't even play the variation where it goes into the endgame, because after knight b3, queen e3 check just wins a pawn, because of this hanging f4 pawn now too. Right, queen e2, we would just take f4. So white doesn't even have that option. And h6 is useful to throw in because now after queen d2, queen b2, in this variation here we can play g5 for black actually. And it turns out after e takes, g takes, black can use this open g file to activate the rook. So for example, bishop e2, rook g8, castles, h3, g3. Black has ideas where he can play rook g5. So it turns out it's actually pretty useful to have that h6 move thrown in. So there are other ideas black has against bishop g5 and f4 too. One of them here is bishop e7, queen f3, h6, and then black has this interesting idea in g5. The point being that after f takes g, black can play, for example, knight h7, and then later capture back on g5. So the point is you want to gain control over the e5 square. So if you look over that Geary-Lagrave game, you'll see that Lagrave also played g5 in that game with the point of securing that square, and that's a theme you'll see in many Najdorf games, is black really trying to control the e5 square, oftentimes by playing g5. So this is one idea too. And the knight bd7 variation is a little bit different. Black has a different conception. So if bishop c4, this is one of the more aggressive continuations, black can play queen b6, again going for this kind of poison pawn idea. And the point is black would like to lure the bishop to b3 so that then he can play e6 followed by knight c5 and hunt that bishop. And if white gives up the pawn, again with a move like queen d2, black's hoping that the pawn is enough compensation for all this activity that white has. And one other interesting idea in this line is, for example, f4, queen c7, queen f3, now h6. And yet again, black has this interesting idea with g5, kind of like a reverse Benko gambit style. But again, black's aiming for control over the e5 square. And white has to take the pawn, because now if you play a move like bishop g3 after black takes, you can't take back because of this fork. So white has to take it, and now queen c5, attacking these two pieces. Bishop e3, knight e5, knight g4, and then for example bishop h6, and white can't castle. So this line is really sharp, and I actually do tend to like this particular position for black because the control over the e5 square, and white has kind of these awkward pieces on the king side. A move like h3 isn't really a big concern for black. For example, black could play queen b4, and then with the attack on b2, black's doing pretty fine here. For example, rook b1, you can play bishop f4. Because of that pin on the h file, the knight's immune, and black's doing pretty well. So as black, you have several ideas you can play against that bishop g5 line. Okay, another big line that Fischer popularized in the 70s and 60s was bishop c4. Although nowadays it doesn't really enjoy the same status because black's found a nice way to combat it. So e6 is good. You want to stop that bishop from attacking f7. By the way, e5 is a common idea in a lot of Najdorf positions, but it's not good against bishop c4 because white just has all its control in the d5 square. It just makes no sense to play it here. So e6, bishop b3, and now black has several ideas here, but probably the simplest is just knight bd7. The point is you can play knight c5, attacking e4, and you can wrap up that bishop. So nowadays you don't really see bishop c4 much at the top level because without the two bishops, it's hard to really exert that much pressure on black. So that's a simple way to combat it. So I won't spend too much time on that. Okay. And what should we look at now? Okay, bishop e3 is, like I was saying earlier, it's one of the critical continuations according to the computers. And it's also been really popular for the last 20 or 30 years. If you've seen that video where Kasparov is just like shocked at his blunder when he's playing Anons in this blitz game, that's actually in this variation with bishop e3. He played knight g4, and they had this kind of quirky variation happen. So that's what this is from. And really against bishop e3, you got three main moves here. Knight g4, as Kasparov liked to do, or you can play e6 or e5. Now, by the way, you'll hear me say it later, but when black plays e6 in Najdorf like this, it's called the Scheveningen. It's I think it's a Dutch word, and I'm not sure what Scheveningen is named after, but the whole point of it is you want to control d5. The problem with playing e5 is you give up control at d5 square pretty much indefinitely. So a little bit different styles there. So first, let's take a look at e5. So after e5, the knight usually goes to b3. This is better than the other squares, basically. If you go to e2, you block your bishop on f1. If you go to f3, the problem is your bishop could be harassed by a knight g4 move, and you're blocking your f-pawn too. So the knight usually goes to b3 to keep the f-pawn's path open here. So then bishop e6, f3, and now you have two ways you can play this as black. You can play knight bd7 and allow white to advance on the king side, and that's a really sharp way, but it's definitely fine. Or you can play h5, which is called the Topalov variation. And the point with this move is you want to stop white from advancing those pawns on the king side. So it's kind of two ideas. If you don't mind, mutual attacks on each other's castle kings like that, then you can play knight bd7. But if you don't want to allow that kind of sharp play, then you should definitely play h5. And by the way, in this pawn structure with e5 and d6 like that, you'll usually put your bishop on e6, followed by knight bd7. You want to get your bishop out first so that it's not stuck on c8. And then, for example, queen d2, you play bishop e7. Play oftentimes goes something like this. So you'll advance on the queen side, and white will advance on the king side. For example, g5, you play b4, and the play gets really messy. So anyways, black, know that these are where minor pieces almost always go, and then you usually try to advance on the queen side pretty quickly. Okay. And by the way, your knight usually doesn't go to c6 for a couple reasons. One problem with going to c6 is that after knight b5, you can't take with a knight because then you would get forked, right? That's one issue. And secondly, you're blocking the c-file. And the Najdorf, a lot of times you'll want to put this rook on the c-file and have it work on there. So knight on c6 is not really useful there. Okay. And the other way of playing this position is you can play e6 in Scheveningen style. So now after f3, you can play b5, or you can play queen c7 or knight bd7. It's pretty flexible. But basically your setup, you're going to want to go b5, bishop b7, knight d7. You're going to put your queen on c7, maybe the rook on c8, and again, you're going to be aiming for this b4 move. So this is essentially how you want to arrange your pieces in a Scheveningen setup, ideally anyway. You can't always get it this way, but that's what you want. And the other way of playing, which is basically the anti-English attack variation. By the way, this bishop e3 move, you'll often hear it called the English attack because English GMs really popularized this in the 90s. So knight g4 is a way of trying to convince white not to play it. So if bishop c1, you can just repeat, ask white, what he really wants to play. One issue is that if white plays bishop g5, although this avoids repeating, the problem is that white loses a lot of time with the bishop getting chased. Black essentially with tempo got this fantastic g7 square for the bishop. And it's definitely a trade-off. Black has really weakened the king side, the f5 square, but he's gained time in development. Okay. And it's for that reason that you'll often see players play f3 as white. But one problem with f3 is that it is pretty committal. So you're committed to playing this English attack line, and it gives black extra possibilities. So in this position, black can play queen b6. And now you can't develop your bishop because of the weakness on b2. So playing f3 early does have a downside in giving black this extra possibility. It's not the end of the world for white either. White has some ideas here too. Okay. Now one of the other critical lines that I mentioned at the beginning was h3. And this is kind of a weird looking move, but the point is not only to defend the g4 square, but actually you want to play g4 yourself. So it kind of hints at a possible massive kingside expansion. So you might play g4. So for example, e6, g4 is really common. And you might even follow up with f4 and just throwing all your kingside pawns down there. So it oftentimes results in a quick kingside attack. Or white may switch modes and play more positionally and fianchetto that bishop on g2 and maybe even castle kingside. So that's a really interesting line. Okay. Now, historically, one of the most popular lines against Najdorf was just bishop e2. Just simple and solid. White just wants to get the bishop out and get castled. And again, here you have the two main ideas. You can either play e5 or you can play e6, and both are equally valid. Again, if you play e5, play is going to be pretty similar to against the English attack. You're going to want to put your bishop on e6, your knight on d7, and your bishop goes to e7, and you'll want to play b5, rook c8. You may consider b4 to undermine the e4 pawn. So those are your ideas there. E6 is actually more complicated here. It leads to a more flexible position. So castles, bishop e7, f4, queen c7. And actually here white has to be a little bit careful and play a4 because essentially black is threatening to play this b5 move. And by the way, b5 is not good right away for black because white can play bishop f3. And this rook on a8 doesn't have a good place to go. You can't play bishop b7 because after e5, say takes on f3, queen takes, black has these two hanging pieces. So this is not good for black. And rook a7 isn't good either because bishop e3 threatens a further discovery on the rook. But queen c7 now threatens it because after b5, bishop b7 will be protected by the queen. So it would be okay. So now white should play a4 to stop you from advancing over there. And now bishop e3, castles. Whoops, did I miss a move? Oh, castles, bishop e3, knight c6. Now king h1 is a really common move. It's useful to get off that diagonal. And now an important move to remember is rook e8. And the point here is a rook on the e file keeps an eye on the bishop on e3 or on the e4 pawn if it opens up. So rook e8 is a really useful move. And now white has a bunch of ideas here. White can play bishop f3, queen d2, knight b3 is a big idea too. But the position also is not as sharp as in many Najdorf variations. It's more positional. So for example, knight b3. The general rule of thumb is that you don't want to allow white to play a5 in these positions. So bishop d7, a5 would be a mistake for black because white can then follow up with bishop e6 and you're going to be really cramped. So you don't want to let white fix your pawns like that. So you play b6 to avoid getting your pawns fixed. And now bishop f3, white's hinting at maybe playing this e5 pawn advance. So you can play rook b8 or knight d7. And then typically in these positions you can follow up with bishop b7, rook b8. For example, queen e2, you might play rook b8, rook d1. Now one idea here is you can even play knight a5. You'll even allow the doubling of a pawns just to open up this b file. So yeah, it's awkward to defend the white queen side. He might have to play a move like bishop c1 and it just keeps his minor pieces tied down. So that's one idea. Or alternatively, you can play your knight to c5 and activate it that way. Your bishop often goes to f8 to help protect the king and open up the e file. So it's a really flexible position. There's a lot of ideas. Sometimes black will aim to play b5, b4, and move that knight from the center. Okay. But the main thing to remember if you play a Scheveningen style is you're going to aim for b5. If white stops it with a4, then you switch modes and go to knight c6 and rook e8. So that's your basic start from there. Okay. Okay, so that's e6 and e5 against bishop e2. A4 is kind of a quirky move. White's essentially avoiding committing any of his pieces, but the reason it's not really that great is it weakens b4. So, one simple idea is just playing knight c6 and, basically taking advantage of that weak b4 square. And if you want, you can play a dragon now. You can switch goals here. You can play g6, bishop g7, castle. And because white's played a4, now he can't play the Yugoslav attack, right? So, if you're a dragon player, you know that the critical way to play for winning against the dragon is the Yugoslav attack. So now that white's played a4, it's no longer an option. Okay. Now another move is g3. So here white aims to fianchetto the bishop, get castled, and with the bishop aiming at the light squares, white has these ideas of knight f5 or knight d5. But one problem with this line is that it leaves the c4 square weak. In the Najdorf, one of the great squares for this queen's knight is c4, because it puts pressure on b2 in case the bishop leaves that square, and attacks a lot of good things. So say here you can play e6, bishop g2. A lot of times you'll see black playing knight d7, knight e5, or b6, and going for that c4 square. Against g3, by the way, black can play e5 too, which it's the choice of Vashir Lagrave, which says a lot. And the point here is that after knight b3, you can play bishop b6, knight d7, rook c8 really quick. And even though white controls the light squares really well, you also control d5 and f5 enough. Okay, and then the Amsterdam variation. So black has a lot of good moves against this. For one, black can just play g6 and transpose to a dragon. And again, white's found himself playing a non-critical variation, right? This is the Levenfish variation now. Or you can just play e5 and stop white from doing it. Or e6 is also fine for black. In any case, one of the problems with playing f4 so early is that when this queen ends up on b6, it can stop white from castling, or simply be a fork with that pawn on b2. So yeah, the Amsterdam variation is playable for white, but very risky. Okay, and by the way, I'll mention there are a lot of advantages to playing the Najdorf. So you may wonder, since you can play e6 against almost all these variations, why not just play it right now? Well, one of the issues with playing e6 immediately is it allows what's called the Keres attack with g4. And this is actually pretty decent for white, theoretically, and it gives black a lot of problems. So by playing the Najdorf, we avoid that, because now at g4 we could just take it, since we attack it twice. So that's one of the advantages of playing this a6 move order. Okay, did I cover everything? Bishop e3, f3, bishop g5. Okay, yeah, I think I did a brief overview of all the lines. I mean, like I said, theory changes a lot, so opening books in the Najdorf, by the way, is not a really good way to learn this opening. A better way to learn it is just simply looking at your databases, so seeing what the GMs are doing, especially current games, and engines. So you want to get some experience too, so if you want to play this opening, play a bunch of blitz games, go over it with the engine, see if you're playing what the top players are playing, and that's your best bet for learning this opening. Like I said, unfortunately, the theory changes so much that opening books aren't that great. I mean, Lumir Fatasnik tried to cover the Najdorf in his Grandmaster Repertoire series for Quality Chess, and I usually recommend those books, but already he has so many holes in his book. He recommends some moves that are just flat out losing, basically. So I can't really recommend that book to you guys. But like I said, look at a database, use an engine, and that will serve you well.